Hi everyone, this is Marc Bates. I'm a metabolic health coach, and today's topic is the flaws of nutritional science. Gotta be careful with what's going on out there. Alright, the failure of nutritional advice. You know that it's now been 7 decades since Americans have followed essentially the same nutritional advice. For these 7 decades, Americans have gotten progressively sicker. This isn't coincidence. It's correlation with a disturbing causal possibility. What if the dietary guidelines themselves are fundamentally flawed? The story of nutritional science is a cautionary tale of how science consensus can fail spectacularly when research methodology is compromised, critical thinking is abandoned, and dogma replaces genuine inquiry. When bad science becomes dietary gospel. In 2002, science journalist Gary Taubes published a groundbreaking article in the New York Times Magazine titled, "What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie?" The piece exposed the weak science behind recommendations to eat a low-fat diet and marked a turning point in public discourse about nutrition. Taubes wasn't a nutritionist. His background in physics and engineering gave him something more valuable: the ability to recognize bad science. Taubes said, "I became obsessed with this. How difficult it is to do good science, right? How hard it is to get the right answer, and how easy it is to screw up." Taubes explains in discussing his journey into nutritional research. What he discovered was troubling. The dietary guidelines that shaped American eating habits since the 1970s were built on a foundation of methodologically flawed studies, selective interpretation of data, and the systematic dismissal of contradictory evidence. The conventional wisdom that saturated fat causes heart disease can be traced back to Ansel Keys' 7-country study from the 1950s. But what many don't know is that previously unpublished data from Keys' research actually showed that lowered cholesterol from vegetable oils did not help people live longer. In fact, the lower cholesterol fell, the higher the risk of dying. 22% higher for every 30-point fall. This isn't an isolated example. Okay, real quick, it really helps the channel out a great deal if you would like, subscribe, press the bell button if you want to get notified. I thank you personally for subscribing and liking these videos. Okay, the insulin hypothesis. Taubes argues that the fundamental error in nutrition science has been the belief that obesity is caused by eating too many calories, rather than understanding it as a hormonal disorder where insulin drives fat storage. This alternative hypothesis explains why low carbohydrate diets work. Reducing carbohydrates lowers insulin, allowing the body to access fat stores and normalize metabolism. The evidence supporting this view continues to accumulate. A systematic review of 29 clinical trials on very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets showed significant reductions in fasting blood sugar, HbA1c levels, insulin resistance, triglycerides, and systolic blood pressure in patients with type 2 diabetes. Virta Health, a company implementing this nutritional approach, has published clinical results showing 54% of patients achieved diabetes reversal, with participants maintaining an average 12 kilogram, 26-pound weight loss over 2 years. These results directly contradict decades of conventional nutritional wisdom. Why bad science persists. If the evidence against conventional dietary guidelines is so strong, why haven't they changed? Unlike other scientific fields where hypotheses are rigorously tested and abandoned when disproven, nutrition science faces unique challenges. First, properly testing nutritional hypotheses requires extremely expensive, long-term studies. When such studies are done and contradict established beliefs, they're often dismissed as flawed rather than accepted as evidence against the prevailing theory. Second, nutritional authorities have built careers and reputations on certain dietary principles. Admitting error would mean acknowledging that their advice may have harmed rather than helped public health. Third, the field suffers from what Taubes describes as a tendency to define the totality of evidence as only the evidence that supports established beliefs. Contradictory findings are systematically excluded from consideration. This is the opposite of how science should work. As Francis Bacon established in 1620 when pioneering the scientific method, good science requires paying special attention to evidence that contradicts your hypotheses. The negative evidence is always the most important evidence because it challenges your assumptions in nutrition science. Negative evidence is routinely ignored. The consequences of dogma. The cost of this scientific failure is measured in human health. Since the introduction of low-fat dietary guidelines in the late 1970s, obesity rates have tripled. Diabetes has increased more than sevenfold. Heart disease remains the leading cause of death. These trends accelerated precisely when Americans began following official dietary advice more closely. What makes this particularly tragic is that effective dietary interventions exist but remain marginalized because they contradict established dogma. When physicians like Dr. Eric Westman at Duke University began testing low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets in clinical trials in the early 2000s, they found not only significant weight loss, but improvements across all metabolic markers. Yet these findings are initially dismissed as dangerous because they contradict conventional wisdom about fat and heart disease. 2 decades later, hundreds of clinical trials have confirmed these results, but official dietary guidelines have barely changed. Breaking free from nutritional dogma. The path forward requires returning to first principles of scientific inquiry. Good science demands intellectual humility and willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads. It requires acknowledging uncertainty and designing experiments, especially to test and potentially disprove your most cherished hypotheses. In nutrition, this means giving greater weight to controlled clinical trials than observational studies. It means acknowledging the limitations of current knowledge rather than making dogmatic pronouncements about what constitutes essential components of a healthy diet. Most importantly, it means being willing to change recommendations when evidence contradicts them. The growing community of physicians prescribing low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets represents a grassroots scientific revolution. These clinicians have seen firsthand how patients improve when conventional dietary wisdom is abandoned. Okay? Their experience-based approach offers a model for how nutrition science could operate. Test interventions, observe results, adjust theories accordingly. This is how science is supposed to work. Beyond dogma, the failure of nutritional science isn't just an academic concern. It affects what millions of people eat every day and consequently their health and longevity. Breaking free from nutritional dogma requires both institutional change and personal skepticism. Institutions must reform how nutritional research is conducted and interpreted. Individuals must question dietary advice, especially when it fails to produce results. The most valuable lesson from Taubes' work isn't about carbohydrates or fat. It's about the danger of scientific consensus that stops questioning itself. When scientists forget that their primary job is to challenge their own assumptions, science stops being science, it becomes religion. And dietary guidelines become dogma. The path to better nutritional science begins with a simple acknowledgement. We might have been wrong, and that's okay. Being wrong is how science advances. That's not okay. What's not okay is refusing to consider the possibility. Our health depends on getting this right. Alright, I want to thank you for watching the video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. And if you have any idea for something you'd like me to cover in a future video, put that down there and I will work on it as soon as I can. Thank you very much.